Hello everybody, it's Melinda and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. This is a webinar about strategic diversity and inclusion as a key to success. And this webinar is a re-recording of yesterday's live webinar, which unfortunately, although it was recorded, we were not quite pleased with the audio quality, so we decided to make it again and bring it in the best possible shape to you. So today we are going to discuss diversity and inclusion from a unique point of view that is going to not only define and sort out what we exactly mean by diversity, but it is also going to show you a way through a new management philosophy that can turn diversity and inclusion into more than something appropriate, beautiful, or popular. It can turn your organization and your personal experience into success. So we are going to start immediately by me telling you what to expect from today's seminar, and then I'm going to introduce myself. Okay, so first of all, I am going to define exactly what we are talking about. And then I'm going to introduce you to the motivation, why it's worth talking about this topic and why it's worth considering diversity and inclusion as one of the fundamental building blocks of your organization. And afterwards, I am going to tell you extensively about the management philosophy that is called human connection, that is going to bring this promise of success through diversity and inclusion. And because I think that we can talk a lot about theory, but the best way to learn is to have a hands-on case, we are going to use one of my articles in which I wrote a case study to demonstrate what the human connection management philosophy can change, what can it bring for us. So without further ado, we are going to jump right in. I would like to tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm sitting here today, because I think this is pretty much the foundation of what we are going to talk about today. So my name is Melinda Becharos, and I'm an expert on diversity and inclusion, and I have a sort of triple professional profile, which means that I have been active in the international professional scene in all three directions. And that allowed me to have a really broad view on the scientific observations about diversity and inclusion, as well as, perhaps more importantly, it allowed me to experience diversity and inclusion in many different ways in diverse environments. What's interesting is that although it sounds absolutely fantastic that I have a triple profile, I have a profile in healthcare. Within that, I was looking after families and young mothers and babies in perinatal care, which means that I'm an expert on the perinatal period from around conception to the second or third year of the child. And within that, I'm specialized in looking into the attachment relationships and the neuroscience of the brain, how attachment and human connections are being built in this early stage of life. And I was also observing what happens to the adults, so the parents in their new role. This gave me the opportunity to understand human connections at its very foundation of the topic. I have my other profile in international business, marketing and management, which really allowed me to understand the interdependency of different sectors around the globe and what people need in these organizations to be effective. Within this direction, I am specialized in cross-cultural management and cross-cultural communication. So again, I went for looking at what's happening to the people. And I'm a big strategic thinker, so strategic management is the angle that I always came from when I was examining cultural competency, cultural management, and cross-cultural communication. My third profile is simply teaching. I have been teaching since I was 8 years old, when I was tiring the neighbors with all sorts of tutoring ideas, and I basically never stopped ever since. I am using my knowledge on neuroscience, sociology, psychology, and in general life experience to find the methods that work best when I'd like to explain something, because it's part of my job. Everything I do, whether I work with families, whether I work with companies, I need to be able to explain what's in my mind and together find a solution. And for that, we need to be on the same page. And for that, excellent teaching skills are very important. So this is my background. And the human connection philosophy, as you will see later, rests pretty much upon all the principles that I bring from the science and the human experience from these directions. Okay. I would like to welcome you to this webinar from the sunlit Tuscany. We are in my living room at the moment, in a house that's over 200 years old, and I find it incredibly inspirational when I'm talking about human connections. And I'm hoping that you will have as great of a time listening to me today as I'm having sitting here in this wonderful, exceptional old house. So let's dig in to the topic. So the first thing that we need to do is to talk about why we need to pay attention to diversity and inclusion. This is an extremely popular topic nowadays. And I think that its popularity was accelerated during the pandemic, when teams became even more global, as everybody could work from home, or well, most of the people could work from home. And also the public consciousness around the differences within our skills and within our categorization as human beings have been increasing in the past few years. So that makes this topic extremely popular. What we see is that on the level of policies, laws, and regulations, diversity and inclusion becomes definitely a point in organizations' agenda, because there is a certain quote of them that they have to reach in terms of diversifying their workforce. And that's a very interesting scenario, and we are going to talk about it, why. But so there is this push to satisfy the numbers in a way. I am going to show you an illustration about diversity and inclusion in order to define. First of all, for a moment, I would like to talk to you why define it. Let me, oh, yes, here we go. So these are my own illustrations, and although I'm not going to win any prize with it, perhaps in terms of the most beautiful illustration in the webinar, I find this the best way to connect to you and show what I'd like to tell. I like to spend my efforts on developing my explanations rather than developing more and more beautiful graphics. So also, I am very well aware of what a hand-drawn, very personal note is going to do to your brain. So let me approach you from this way, and I hope that you can read my letters, but I will explain everything. So why do we need to define diversity and inclusion? I find that this topic is an incredibly huge umbrella. It's including everything under the sun, which is a problem. Because if we don't define exactly what we are talking about, what we mean by diversity and inclusion, it is going to dilute our message. And it is going to dilute our message in an environment that is typically very sensitive. So in other words, you need to know what you're talking about, what you're addressing in terms of diversity and inclusion. So let's have a look. What is included here, really? Well, diversity and inclusion includes cultural diversity, for sure. Here we mean that different groups of people living according different kinds of rules, following different kinds of values, and they create their own little groups this way. That brings cultural diversity. Typically, we talk about cultural diversity in the context of different nationalities. But cultural diversity can also mean simply the diversity of different kind of subcultures. Please excuse the cat outside. I can't quite switch the cat off. So we're just going to have a companion here. So the next thing that we need to look at is that diversity also means, for example, diversity in terms of genders and how we approach genders. Here I'm thinking about rights for men, rights for women, and everything in between, in every sense that we can think of. The LGBTQ++ community, everything around this topic is also under this huge umbrella. Dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphy, everything around studying what we in the old days called, let's say, learning difficulties or learning disabilities. Now we know that these are mostly learning opportunities in different brain structures, but this also falls under this umbrella. So does people with challenges when it comes to physical movement. So this is so very broad that you really need to know what you're talking about when you're talking about diversity and inclusion. Having said that, the best way, of course, is to sort of address it as uniformly as we can so everybody feels included. I'm going to sort this out because it seems a little paradox, but let's just move on and look at what these concepts mean one by one. So here, diversity. Diversity is, by my definition, and there are many, by my definition, it is a fact of life. Diversity is everywhere. If you think about the rainforest, and this is my absolutely advanced illustration of the rainforest. If you think about the rainforest, diversity makes it up. Plants are near to the soil, high in the sky, and everything in between, competing with each other, but finding their own place in biodiversity, specializing in what they can do, and by fulfilling their role that they do the best, they are supporting biodiversity, they are supporting the entire ecosystem. So, but if you relate this topic to humans only, we are also naturally diverse. For example, if you've ever heard of sensory processing sensitivity or high sensitivity, this is a part that I often coach people about, and I definitely mention it during my trainings. This is typically a kind of brain structure that makes you more susceptible, more sensitive to certain things. And 80% of the people approximately don't really have this brain structure, while 20% of people have it. And that creates actually certain advantages, certain evolutionary advantages. So it has a point. So also very similar, dyslexic thinking. People with dyslexia, they have a different brain structure from other people. It doesn't mean that it's worse. It doesn't mean that it's better. It means that it's different. And we are complementing each other, because if you look at the outcome of a team that has a dyslexic and a non-dyslexic person, it's very likely that you will get something really amazing that is more than if you would have consulted only one person instead of the team. So diversity is everywhere. It's a fact of life. And what's very interesting is that this diversity has been narrowed down quite a bit when it comes to the working environment. If you look back in time, several hundred years ago, it was very typical to see white middle-aged man in leading positions. I'm not saying this to call out anybody. I'm just really stating something that had been happening in history. Some of the stereotypes are still with us. Some of these things are still happening. For example, if you look at women in the workforce, you are going to see really varying situations across the globe. Same goes for men and paternity leave. You have very different approaches. And again, same goes for the LGBTQ++ community, where gender might define someone's career path, and it can be debated how ethical it is and how much more we could achieve with full inclusion. Okay, so there is this artificial narrowing down. However, in the last few years, as diversity and inclusion became more popular, we see an opening up towards this topic, and this natural diversity seems to be artificially brought back into organizations. So that's a very interesting moment to talk about it. Now, if you look at inclusion, that is going to be a very different thing from diversity, because it's an act. Inclusion is something that you are going for actively. It's an act to manage diversity. So while diversity is there as a fact, inclusion is something that you have to do. And that makes it very interesting. We have to be conscious about that. Diversity and inclusion means that I have diversity, and I do something about it. In practice, it's very often so that people, organizations realize diversity, and they do not address inclusion actively enough. We are going to see some examples. Okay, so these concepts are clear now. The question is, how can we manage this? Better yet, why should we do that? And this is when psychological safety comes into place. And let me just stop screen sharing for a moment. So I prefer to talk to you from a bit of a close-up whenever I can. What is the benefit of thinking about diversity and inclusion? Well, hopefully we feel like we can relate to this, that if you are excluded in an environment, if you're not welcome, if you're not feeling comfortable, that feels rotten. And this is not a word that it's often used in professional presentations, but I find that this is the most describing, this is the word that describes best the feeling when you're not included into something, when you're part of an organization and you're excluded. That just feels rotten. And it's going to bring all sorts of issues. If we are talking about inclusion, then we often mention psychological safety. And psychological safety is nothing else than, oops, just a moment, please. Is nothing else than being able to be yourself without fear of negative consequences to your own self-image, status, or career. Often it's also defined as being yourself, or being able to be yourself and express yourself freely as long as you mean well. Okay, it's again a really broad definition, but it's much talked about in this context, and this is why. So if you imagine that you have a diverse environment, and you can imagine it in many ways, just imagine as many types of people as you possibly can, okay? And you would like them to all feel accepted and safe, psychologically safe, so they don't need to stress about who they are and what they can bring to the table. They can only focus on their profession and their passion, and basically can be present in the moment without any issues that would come from the organization, because obviously we are human beings and we have good and bad days. That's not talking about that, okay? So that on one hand on the scale, because I see it as a scale, you have exclusion and discrimination. And the other hand, you have inclusion. Now, things are usually not all bad or all good, but in the middle of this scale, there is being neutral, going to an environment that you can just get by. It's okay. You don't feel bad, you don't feel fantastic, but it's okay. Now, if you go towards discrimination, for example, breastfeeding mother who is not able to meet her baby during work hours and who is not provided any space to extract, that's a discrimination. Or if she's provided but sort of you know, it's not really appreciated, then that person is going to feel uncomfortable both mentally and physically. Okay, and if people actively would be bullying this person, then we are talking about a toxic behavior that is psychologically damaging. In that case, that organization and in that little microenvironment where this situation is going on is going to be less productive, less effective. This person is not going to be happy. The bully is also spending energy and time on bullying. So this is a loss of energy, which I signal with this red arrow, okay? On the other hand, moving from neutral to something more positive, you'll find psychological safety. And that allows you to be calm, sometimes to be even bored, sometimes to just, be yourself and bring your optimum. When you work calmly, when you can focus on what you're good at, that's psychological safety in terms of how it works in an organization, the way I envision it. And I explain it to you today. Now, if we go just a step further, and we are now nearing very much the human connection philosophy, then we see that we can not only provide a psychologically safe environment, but we can be curious about it. We can say that, oh, you're different, that's great. What do you know that I don't? What are the things that you see that are unseen to me? What are the ideas that might pop up for you and I would have never come up with it? This is when you're curious about differences, and this is when you appreciate these different ideas. You're not afraid of them. You don't feel like you have to discriminate them, Going back to one of my favorite examples of a breastfeeding mother, if someone nails the balance between breastfeeding and work, that person has learned a lot. And you can learn from the person, and you can see, for example, time management and efficiency, and it's pinnacle. So obviously not all cases are the same, but in this theoretical case, you can really be curious and appreciative about it. You can also be very supportive. There are so many ways to approach it that is bringing a positive outcome for both the person and the organization. Okay,